Welcome to the first episode of In Sync by Synconomics, where we help employers put the benefits back in their benefit.
Yeah, and if you're asking in sync with what, that's a great question. It's in sync with your business goals, in sync with your employees, and in sync with your values.
Because we come across far too many companies who, quite frankly, don't realize some of the potential red flags that are in their benefit packages and are walking around with targets on their backs.
Yeah, well, that's why we're here, James. And so maybe we should back up a little bit. Why don't you introduce yourself to the people listening?
Great. I'm James Holland. I've spent the better part of the last 30 years working in the retirement plan space, where I've helped design, evaluate, and implement retirement plans for employers of all different sizes. And in that 30 years, we've come across a lot of people who really don't know what they don't know and what the changes they need to make. So that's what we're trying to do here is, again, that's why we founded the company with Jamie.
I'm a lot younger than James. I've been doing this for 29 years in a similar fashion, and most recently in the last 10 have crossed over to also analyze the impact of not only the retirement side, but also the healthcare side for the average American employer and the average American worker. And we'll get into all that in just a moment.
Great. And you keep saying that, Jamie, that we're going to get into it. So what exactly are we going to talk about in our first episode, and how are we going to get there?
Well, the plan is to start with some current events. That's why we're here, right? Changes in the industry that are putting people at risk. We'll also talk about the real things companies can look into to see what they can do about it. What I like to call the so what, now what do we do about that? And we'll bring on a few guests.
Good, because again, we've spent the better part of the last 2 decades working in this, meeting some really great people who can bring some tremendous value to our discussions.
Yeah, and since it's our very first episode, we can't start with anybody else but our most important guest, which is Alice. And we're going to introduce her to you next. So who is Alice? Well, Alice is really not a person. It's an acronym. It is basically a trapped employee financially and a financially strapped employee. The United Way came up with the term and invented the term, which is asset limited, income constrained, yet employed.
Yes, people who are working there because they have to, not because they want to.
And that usually is not only bad for the person, but also bad for the business, right, James?
Exactly. Again, people who are not motivated, again, someone that's just there for a paycheck is going to obviously not be as productive as someone who buys into the mission and the ideas behind what the employer looks to do.
One of the biggest reasons Alice exists, the biggest villain in the story, we believe, is healthcare costs. And we talked about that earlier. I prompted it a couple of times and James yelled at me, of course. But healthcare is a major part of their paycheck right now. And they just have too much month at the end of the paycheck. And that's creating a lot of economic pressure on them and therefore invariably on the employers that they work for.
Exactly. So therefore, now, again, we talked about that paycheck to paycheck approach, or the person's there again, because they have to, not because they want to, and they're losing not just the productivity, but the mental aspect of things and the stress from the financial constraint that an overwhelming portion of that paycheck is going to cover medical expenses, which a lot of them are afraid to use because of how it impacts not just their dollars, but their time at work as well.
Yeah, I think there's probably no less than 8 to 10 different hard and soft KPIs. I would start with engagement, satisfaction, culture, loyalty, absenteeism, presenteeism. Let's not forget to talk about turnover, right? We had that war for talent, and then we had the silent, what was it called? The silent quitters that were sitting inside companies that just didn't want to be there anymore. What's an employer to do, James?
Yeah, and again, and what happens to that point there, that silent quitter, again, is sitting around, taking that paycheck, not producing anything, taking a portion of that, paying higher premiums, of which the employer is not doing the proper investigation in terms of looking for opportunities. There's a win-win for both the employer and the employee if they can have that discussion in terms of how to balance not just the time, but who pays for what.
So we know there's a problem. We know there's a problem worth solving. I'm going to ask my favorite question. So what, now what do we do about it?
Yeah, and we talked a little bit about the retirement plan space and the changes that have taken place, and I'm sure in future episodes we'll get into the legislation and the litigation and the regulation. But the healthcare is so much more important, and I think will happen much faster only because the retirement is down the road for a lot of people. The healthcare is every day, whether it's the employee, the spouse, the children. They're impacted on a daily basis there. So I think that hat tip to Malcolm Gladwell, but that tipping point is going to come a whole lot faster. And again, it doesn't have to be a negative one. There are ways of controlling the costs for the employer without negatively impacting the benefits with the employees.
Yeah, no doubt. I think that's a great point because most people think you just start taking things away. I think you and I have both experienced 10 years of what our industry would call financial wellness that largely has been ineffective and has not moved the needle. But if you do this right, you can not only save precious cash flow for the employer, you can actually create no out-of-pocket healthcare plans for the employee, and essentially giving them a $6,000 to $7,000 raise because they don't have deductibles, co-pays, co-insurance, or premiums.
Which goes back to your first point, Jamie, exactly, in terms of whoever surveys, and again, I know not like, the MailChimp, here are 10 questions, fill in, get a real feel for what they're looking for. What will they pay for? What do they not want to pay for? And that's where you can get some actual change instead of some buzzword like wellness or something along those lines. Get into what the true concerns are for the employees. And I think that's where the first step in making the difference is.
Yeah, no doubt. No doubt.
Great. And Jamie, again, obviously we're trying to tie in some current events, and I don't think there's a bigger one than the big, beautiful bill. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to fit in on the benefit side, but if you want to speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure we're done unpacking the big, beautiful bill and understanding the ramifications, but there's certainly a lot of attention on healthcare. And just the other day, I think the president himself was on talking about drug prices just the other day. So, but before that, and why Synchronomics was really invented was to help employers with some of their blind spots about trends that were happening right underneath their noses and they didn't see until it was too late, such as rising healthcare, right, for the last 30 years, and employees living paycheck to paycheck, right, that can't afford healthcare and what to do about it. And so then the employer can't afford healthcare, so they create a high deductible health plan. And then you have ACA under the Obama administration, which essentially laid the groundwork for the financial rules of 85 and 15 cents on the dollar, right? So 85% of the dollar had to go towards care, 15 cents was administration and profit. That set the rules in motion for an entire industry to grow from about 3 trillion to what it is today at 5 trillion. And that's the growth that was unnoticed. It was a blind spot for most employers. We're trying at Synchronomics to highlight and illuminate that blind spot and then help employers with what to do about the problems associated with that blind spot.
And again, so you're talking a $2 trillion increase in spend, and the only person who did not benefit from it were the employees who are, again, if you look at it from a fiduciary perspective, it's solely and exclusively supposed to be designed for them, not for all the people who have their hands, per se, in the cookie jar. And that goes back to why they changed the disclosure rules in the retirement plan. And we had Secure 1.0 and 2.0. We've been talking about the changes to the fiduciary rule for the better part of a decade and how that impacts it. And I think, again, because of the day-to-day concerns of the employee, I think the employee grasping the need for change on the healthcare side will come much quicker than it did on the retirement plan side, which again is the whole point. Jamie mentioned Synchronomics. We're trying to look at it from a economic perspective and a psychological perspective and a physical health perspective. And that's the whole idea behind the forming of the company.
Well, let's hope so, because the current trends are all pointing to something that's unsustainable for the American employer and the average American worker.
And that's where, again, and not to harp on the name of the company, but we also have to synchronize the thought process for the employer and the employee. One of the examples I try to use is getting them on the same side of the table and let them know, hey, by the way, there are other options. You're not beholden to a system just because it existed for 30 years. You're allowed to make changes. You're allowed to take control. And if you join together and have one voice, then you can have a much bigger impact for both. The benefit industry is broken, and it's broken because we can't define who it's benefiting. So again, Jamie and I have known each other for the better part of the last 2 decades. I think the idea behind Synchronomics started forming 4 or 5 years ago when we saw the impact that litigation had on the retirement plan space. And we sensed that it wasn't too far down the road that it was going to start hitting the healthcare space, which it has. Again, it hasn't, the results are certainly a mixed bag at this point. But again, the problem was there were people who were on the inside claiming to make changes and trying to be the standard bearer for the participant. And that's a conflict of interest. And it always has been, whether it's retirement, healthcare, or any other benefit, where they didn't have that true advocate, because you can't have the fox guarding the hen house saying, I'm going to take care of all the hens. And we're not trying to disparage anyone. All we're trying to say is the time has come for people to choose a side. And there's too much debate going back and forth, and people trying to use that wellness speak and all the other things here. There's going to be a line drawn in the sand, and you're going to have to decide which side you're on. And we can have the employer and the employee be on the same side and take control. And that's the whole idea behind the Synchronomics. Jamie?
Yeah. And for me, at that moment, a couple things, right? These trends are unsustainable for the employer and unsustainable for the average American worker, i.e. Alice. No one is truly representing the employer in this equation right now, putting all the math together and then coming up with some solid, effective, so what, now what do I do about it? That you've shown me the data, you've explained the trends, you've explained my liability. What do I do on Monday? Then help me take care of my chief asset, which is Alice. The people that are behind the wheel of a truck, dispensing medicine on the hospital floor, in the shop, right? Or on the floor at the supermarket. There's 100 million 401k plan participants in the country. And I think 99 million cannot afford to retire and don't have money. That's a pretty paltry statistic. And I think Synchronomics can help fix that for the American employer.
Yeah. On behalf of the employee, again, all we're saying here is there's clearly a common ground. I just don't think there's been any conversation on how to get both parties there.
Yeah.
And hopefully that's what we'll continue to have that discussion. And that's the whole point behind InSync.
And by and large, probably over the last 5-10 years, maybe even 20, the term financial wellness has been ineffective. It hasn't moved the needle. It's gotten worse, right? It was about 70% of Americans couldn't afford to retire, and 50% didn't have an emergency account before COVID. It got even worse after COVID, and then stack on top of that the rising cost of healthcare, which they have to have. The math just doesn't work for the average American worker or Alice. And call it disruptive. I call it being a good steward or a good fiduciary. I mean, we're supposed to have duty of loyalty, right? And do no harm. And we need to fix that going forward. And I think every stakeholder wins.
Yeah, one of the things I guess we're going to see is over the last decade or so, with a lot of the litigation on the retirement plan side, there was a big focus on the fiduciary aspect when people did not realize that same fiduciary aspect applies to healthcare. And now that is coming to light, which is obviously causing a great concern for a number of employers who were unfamiliar with that role as far as where they fit in offering the benefits to their employees.
Yeah, and it's a two-edged sword, right? I know everyone's trying to unpack the big, beautiful bill as we speak, but let's not blow by the fact that we had the Hospital Transparency Act, the Transparency and Coverage Act, and the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which does create some fiduciary responsibility and liability for the employer, but also gives, for the first time in history, a healthcare fiduciary the tools to start holding their covered service providers accountable, getting the data they need, and developing these plans and programs that help Alice and the income statement and balance sheet of the company itself. So, James, I know we've talked a lot about our mission and the so what, now what, but let's take the listeners back to the beginning about our Jerry Maguire moment and why we decided we needed to co-found Synchronomics.
It was the Valentine. It was at the resort with Wilborn.
With Wilborn.
There was no dancing. But there was a napkin that basically said healthcare, retirement, that type of thing.
The Venn diagram. So it wasn't the Show Me the Money episode or segment as much as it was the
help me help you.
That's so it was when the hockey player got hurt in the hospital.
Yeah.
And the Jerry Maguire, figured out that he was insignificant and irrelevant to that person's life at that point, and he kind of had to reinvent himself. And then he wrote had bad pizza and wrote the memo.
And for the younger folks in the audience who are not familiar with the Jerry Maguire reference, Jamie, can you give them a little more context, please?
Yes, of course. First of all, great movie. Several segments that they should all watch and take away. But there's the scene where Jerry Maguire's in the hospital and one of his clients, he's a sports agent, one of his clients is all banged up. I think it's a hockey player. And the little kid is there, and he realizes, he tells the little kid, your dad's going to be fine, and his dad's not going to be fine. And he realized that he was relatively painfully insignificant and irrelevant in what he was doing every single day. And that's really the aha moment we had about financial wellness and what we were trying to accomplish in our industry. I'll tell you another great moment, though, is when Cuba Gooding Jr. also screams, show me the money, because if you do this right, you can fix Alice, you can fix the employer, and you can show the average American employer and employee the money.
And no better way to end the podcast than a movie reference for those who do stick around for future episodes. There'll be plenty of those as well. So thank you all for affording us a little time.